Chapter 1. A Man and a Boy. Will could see only one reason for having children. When you are old and poor, then they could look after you.
Will Freeman was 36 years old, and he had never had a job in his life. Sometimes he thought about working. He looked through the job advertisements in newspapers and wrote occasional letters to employers, but he was never invited to interviews. He didn't mind. He was okay as he was. He was a cool guy with a cool lifestyle. He read quite a lot. He saw films in the afternoons. He went running. He cooked nice meals for himself and his friends. When he got bored, he went to Rome or New York or Barcelona for a few days. Will didn't need to work for money, because in 1938, his father had written a very successful Christmas song. Many famous singers had made recordings of this song, and each time Will's father had received royalties. Since his death, the royalties had come to Will. So Will had become rich without having to work at all. He was happy with his life. He lived in a nice flat in London and drove a fast car. He liked women and had lots of girlfriends, but he never got too involved with them. He preferred to look at other people's lives from the outside, like watching TV. If a relationship with a woman became complicated, he ended it. He wanted to keep his life simple. In the evenings, Will usually went out with friends. These were guys who worked in music shops or belonged to the same sports clubs as Will, or who were part of the same pub quiz team. They weren't close friends, but they were good enough for a drink or a meal. The evenings were fine, but Will had a lot of free time during the day because all his friends were at work. So he filled the time with different half-hour activities: reading the paper, having a bath, tidying his flat, going to the shops, watching Countdown. Countdown was an afternoon TV quiz show, and it was his favourite programme. Sometimes he wondered how his friends had time to work. How could a person work and have a bath on the same day? Will didn't like children. He wasn't interested in them, and he didn't want any responsibility for them. But his friends, John and Christine, had two. The second was a baby girl, born just the week before, and Will had been invited to see her. When he arrived at John and Christine's flat, there were children's toys everywhere. Pieces of brightly coloured plastic were spread all over the floor. Videos lay out of their cases near the TV. A white cloth over the sofa was covered with dirty brown marks. How could people... Christine came in holding the new baby, while John was in the kitchen making tea. "This is Imogen," she said. "Oh," said Will. "Right." He paused. What did people usually say about babies? He began, but stopped again. It was no good. He decided to ask Christine about herself instead. "How are you, Chris?" he asked. "Well, I'm rather tired." "Why? A lot of parties?" "No, I've just had a baby." "Oh, right." John came into the room carrying 3 cups of tea. "Barney's gone to his grandmother's today," he said, for no reason that Will could understand. "How's Barney?" Barney was 2, and interesting only to his parents, but Will knew he should ask John something. "He's fine, thanks," said John. "He's still getting used to Imogen, but he's lovely." Will had met Barney before and knew that he wasn't lovely, but he decided not to say anything. "What about you, Will?" "I'm fine, thanks." "Don't you want your own family?" "I can't think of anything worse," thought Will. "Not yet," he said. "We're worried about you," said Christine. "I'm okay as I am, thanks," said Will. "Maybe," said Christine, and smiled. Will was beginning to feel very uncomfortable. Why did they want him to have children? Children would make him very unhappy. If John and Christine wanted children and to be unhappy, that was fine. Will was sure that John and Christine were very unhappy, even if they didn't realize it. But why should they want him to be unhappy too? Will could see only one reason for having children. When you were old and poor, then they could look after you. But Will had plenty of money, so he didn't need toys on the floor or dirty sofas. John and Christine used to be okay, he thought. Will and a girlfriend had gone out to nightclubs with them once or twice a week, and they had all had a lot of fun. But since John and Christine had had children, everything had changed. Will didn't want to meet Imogen or hear how Barney was. He didn't want to hear about Christine's tiredness. He decided not to visit them again. "We were wondering," said John, "whether you'd like to be Imogen's godfather." The two of them looked at Will, smiling and waiting for his... He couldn't help his mum with her problems, and she couldn't help him with his other big problem, school. His first day at his new London school had been a disaster. Marcus knew that he was different from most other kids of his age. He wasn't right for schools. Not big secondary schools like the one in London. His school in Cambridge hadn't been so bad. The children there were younger, and there were lots of weird kids there, so Marcus hadn't felt uncomfortable. It was okay not to be right for some things, he thought. He knew that he wasn't right for parties, because he was very shy. That wasn't a problem, because he didn't have to go to parties. But he had to go to school. Marcus couldn't talk to his mum about his problems at school, because she couldn't help. She couldn't move him to another school. Even if she did move him, it wouldn't make any difference. He'd still be himself, and that, it seemed to Marcus, was his real problem. The other kids laughed at him because he was weird. They laughed because he had the wrong trousers, the wrong shoes, and the wrong haircut. Marcus knew that he was weird, partly because his mum was weird. She was always telling him that clothes and hair weren't important. She didn't want him to watch rubbish TV, or listen to rubbish music, or play rubbish computer games. All the other kids spent their time doing these things, but Marcus had to argue with his mother for hours, and he usually lost. She could explain why it was better for him to listen to singers from the 1960s, like Bob Marley and Joni Mitchell, and why it was more important to read books than to play on the Game Boy that his dad had given him. He was quite happy at home, listening to Joni Mitchell or reading books, but it didn't do him any good at school. It made him different, and because he was different, the other kids made him feel uncomfortable. It wasn't all his mum's fault. Sometimes Marcus just did weird things, like the singing. He always sang songs to himself inside his head, but sometimes, when he was nervous, the song just came out of his mouth. It had happened in his English lesson on the first day of his new school. The teacher was reading, and all the other students in the room were quiet. Suddenly, for no reason at all, Marcus had started to sing, and all the other kids had laughed at him.
Chapter 2. Spat. Marcus was shocked. What did she mean they weren't doing each other any good? She wasn't doing him any good, but what had he done to her?
Will first saw Angie in a music shop off the Holloway Road. She had lots of thick blonde hair, big blue eyes, and a lovely, sexy voice. She reminded him of Julie Christie, a beautiful film star. 2 days later, he saw her again in a cafe and started a conversation. By the time they had finished their coffee, he had her phone number. Will was rather surprised that Angie wanted to go out with him. He had never been out with a woman who looked like Julie Christie before. Women like her didn't go out with men like Will. They went out with other film stars, or lords, or racing drivers. He learnt the reason over dinner on their first evening out, when Angie told him that she was a single mother with 2 small kids. It wasn't easy for her to get out and meet new men, and a lot of men didn't like other people's children. Will wanted to push the table over and run out of the restaurant, but Angie was a very beautiful woman. "Really, it's no problem. I've never been out with a mum before, and I've always wanted to. I think I'd be good at it." "Good at what?" Right. Good at what? What was he good at? That was the big question which he had never been able to answer. Maybe he would be good at children, although he hated them. Maybe he should give John and Christine and baby Imogen another chance. Maybe he was going to become Uncle Will. I don't know. Doing things that kids like. For the next few weeks, he was Will the good guy, and he loved it. It wasn't even very difficult. He played with Angie's children, and took them to McDonald's, and to parks, and for a boat trip on the river. It was a very good arrangement, he thought. He had never wanted to be a father, but this was different. He could walk hand in hand with a beautiful woman while the children played in front of them. Everybody could see him doing it. And at the end of the afternoon, he could go home again if he wanted to. Angie made Will feel very good about himself. Suddenly, he became better looking, a better lover, a better person. And she especially loved him because he wasn't her ex-husband, who had problems with drink and work, and who was sleeping with his... Will went out with Angie for 6 weeks, but there were some things that he was beginning to find difficult. Once, he booked tickets for the opening night of a new film, but Angie was half an hour late because she couldn't get a babysitter. And when they spent the night together, it always had to be at her place, and she didn't have a video machine or many CDs. But just when Will was thinking about ending the relationship, Angie decided to finish it. "Will, I'm so sorry, but I'm not sure this is working. It's not your fault. You've been great. It's me. Well, my situation, anyway. I've met you at the wrong time of my life, and I'm not ready for a serious new relationship." It really was very strange, Will thought. Angie had believed he was serious about her, and he hadn't been serious at all. Now she was starting to cry. He had never before watched a woman cry without feeling responsible, and he was rather enjoying the experience. "You don't have to be sorry for anything, really." Of all the evenings he had spent with Angie, he loved the last one the best. The relationship had been perfect, and had finished in a perfect way, too. Usually when his relationships with women ended, he felt guilty. But this time he had nothing to feel guilty about. Will knew then that there would be other women like Angie. Bright, attractive, single mothers. Thousands of them, all over London. And he knew he had a lot to offer them. He could sleep with them, make them feel better about themselves, be a parent for a limited time, and walk away without feeling guilty. What more could a man want? One Monday morning, Marcus's mum started crying before breakfast, and it frightened him. Morning crying was something new, and it was a bad, bad sign. It meant that it could now start at any time of the day, without warning. When he went into the kitchen, she was sitting at the kitchen table in her nightclothes, a half-eaten piece of toast on her plate, her eyes red from crying. Marcus never said anything when she cried. He didn't know what to say. He didn't understand why she did it. And because he didn't understand, he couldn't help. So he stood there, staring at her, with his mouth open. "Do you want some tea?" she asked him, in a sad little voice. "Yes, please." He made some toast, drank his tea, and picked up his bag. Then he gave his mother a kiss and went out. Neither of them said a word. What else could he do? On his way to school, he tried to work out what was wrong with her. What could be wrong that he didn't know about? He didn't think it was money problems. She had a job. She was a music teacher. So they weren't poor, although they weren't rich either. But they had enough money for the flat, and for food, and for holidays once a year, and even for occasional computer games. What else made you cry? Death? But he'd know if anybody important had died. He'd seen all his relatives, his grandparents, his Uncle Tom, and Uncle Tom's family at a party the week before, and they'd all been fine. Was it about men? He knew his mum wanted a boyfriend because she joked about it sometimes. But if she joked about it, why should she suddenly start crying about it? So what else was there? He tried to remember the other things that people cried about on TV programs. Prison? An unwanted baby? But Marcus had forgotten about his mum's problems by the time he was inside the school gates. He had his own problems to think about. A group of kids usually bullied him on his way across the playground. Today, though, they were at the other end, so he reached his classroom without difficulty. His friends Nicky and Mark were already there, playing a game on Mark's Game Boy. He went over to them. "All right?" Nicky said hello, but Mark was too busy to notice him. Marcus tried to watch the game, but he couldn't see the Game Boy very well, so he sat on a desk, waiting for them to finish. But when they finished, they started another game. They didn't offer him a game, or put the Game Boy away. Marcus felt he was being shut out, and he didn't know what he'd done wrong. "Are you going to the computer room at lunchtime?" he asked. That was how he knew Nicky and Mark, through the computer club. It was a stupid question, because they always went to the computer room. It was the only place where they would be safe from the other kids. "Don't know," replied Nicky after a time. "What do you think, Mark?" "Don't know," said Mark. They weren't real friends, not like the friends he'd had in Cambridge. But he could talk to them because they were all different from the other kids in the class. All three of them wore glasses. None of them was interested in clothes, and they all liked computer games. Two older boys came and stood in the doorway. "Give us a song," they said to Marcus. Marcus didn't know these boys, but they'd probably heard about him singing in the English class. Mark and Nicky started to move away, leaving him alone. Then the older boys started insulting Mark and Nicky and making jokes about girls and sex. Mark turned the Game Boy off, and all three of them stood, waiting for the boys to get bored and go away. Marcus tried to play a game inside his head, listing different kinds of chocolate. At last, the two older boys left. The three of them didn't say anything for a time. Then Nicky looked at Mark, and Mark looked at Nicky, and finally Mark spoke. "Marcus, we don't want you with us." "Oh," said Marcus. "Why not?" "Because of them." "They're not my problem." "Yes, they are," said Mark. "We never got into trouble with anyone before we knew you, and now we have problems every day." Marcus understood. They would be better without him. But he had nowhere else to go. Will was looking for ways to meet single mums like Angie, but he didn't know where to find them. Where did single mums go? And how could he get their phone numbers? Then he had a wonderful idea. He would pretend to be a single father and join a single parents group. So he invented a 2-year-old son called Ned. "I'm a single father. I have a 2-year-old son." "I'm a single father. I have a 2-year-old son," he told himself. But he couldn't actually believe it. He didn't feel like a parent. He was too young, too old, too stupid, too intelligent, too cool, too impatient, too selfish, too careless, too careful. When he looked in the mirror, he couldn't see a dad. He telephoned a single parents group called Spat, Single Parents Alone Together, and spoke to a woman called Frances. Spat met on the first Thursday of each month in a local adult learning centre, and Frances invited Will to the next meeting. He was very worried that he'd get something wrong, like the name of his imaginary son. He couldn't stop thinking of him as Ted, not Ned. The centre was a depressing place with lots of classrooms. Will listened for the sounds of a party, but he couldn't hear anything. Finally, he noticed a small piece of paper on a classroom door with the word Spat on it. There was only one woman in the room. She was taking bottles of white wine, beer, and water out of a box and putting them on a table in the centre of the room. All the other tables and chairs had been pushed to the back of the room. It was the most depressing place for a party that Will had ever seen. "Have I come to the right place?" he asked the woman. She had a sharp nose and a bright red face. "Spat, come in. Are you Will? I'm Frances." Will smiled and shook her hand. "I'm sorry, there's nobody else here yet," she said. "A lot of people are late because of problems with babysitters." "Of course," said Will. He was wrong to come on time, he thought. He should pretend to have babysitting problems too. But then the other members of Spat began to arrive, all women in their 30s, and Frances introduced him to each of them. The most attractive was a tall, blonde, nervous-looking woman. After she came into the room, he stopped looking at anybody else. "Hello," he said. "I'm Will. I'm new, and I don't know anybody." "Hello, Will. I'm Susy. I'm old, and I know everybody." He laughed. She laughed. He spent most of the evening with her. She talked a lot, and he listened. He was very happy to listen, because he didn't want to talk about Ned. Susy had been married to a man called Dan, who had left her the day before she gave birth to her daughter Megan. Susy told him about the other women in the room. It was the same story. Their husbands had all left them with children to look after. Will began to feel very depressed about being a man. How could men behave so badly? "I'm sorry," said Susy at last. "I haven't asked you anything about yourself. Did your wife leave you?" "Well, yes." "And does she see Ned?" "Sometimes. She's not very interested in him." He was beginning to feel better. He could show her that women could behave badly too. He was acting, yes, but he was doing it well, just like Robert De Niro. "How does Ned feel about that?" asked Susy. "Oh, he's a good little boy," said Will. "Very brave." To his surprise, he was beginning to feel quite upset. Susy put a hand on his arm. She likes me, Will thought. Great. Some parts of Marcus's life continued normally. He went to his dad's in Cambridge for the weekend and watched a lot of TV. On the Sunday, he and his dad and Lindsay, his dad's girlfriend, went to Lindsay's mum's house. Lindsay's mum lived by the sea, and they went for a long walk on the beach. Marcus liked Lindsay's mum. He liked Lindsay too. Even his mum liked Lindsay. Marcus felt better after the weekend in Cambridge. He had a good time with everybody, and nobody seemed to think he was weird. But the day after he got back, he came home from school and found his mum lying on the floor with a coat over her. "Didn't you go to work today?" "This morning, I was sick this afternoon." "What kind of sick?" asked Marcus. She didn't reply, and Marcus felt angry. He was only a kid, and things couldn't continue like this. He was having an awful time at school and an awful time at home, and school and home were almost the only places he knew. So someone was going to have to help him, and that person had to be his mum. She had to do something about it. He was only a kid, and she was his mum, and if he felt bad, it was her job to stop him feeling bad. "What kind of sick?" he asked again, in a rough voice. She began to cry, and Marcus felt frightened. "You've got to stop this." "I can't." "You've got to. If you can't look after me, then you'll have to find someone who can." His mum turned over on her stomach and looked at him. "How can you say I don't look after you?" "Because you don't. You make my meals, and I could do that. The rest of the time you just cry. That's no good. That's no good to me." She cried even more then. Marcus went upstairs and played a computer game. But when he came downstairs again, she had got up and was cooking supper. "You're going to a picnic on Saturday," she said suddenly. "A picnic? Where?" "In Regent's Park." "Who with?" "Susy." "Not that Spat crowd." "Yes, that Spat crowd. I hate them." When Marcus and his mum had first moved to London, they had gone to a Spat summer party in someone's garden. It had been full of horrible little kids, all about 10 years younger than Marcus. "Are you going?" he asked. "No, I need a rest. You told me to find someone to look after you, so that's what I'm doing. Susy's better at it than I am." Susy was Fiona's best friend. They'd known each other since their school days. She was nice, and Marcus liked her a lot, but he didn't want to go to a Spat picnic. "I can stay here. I'll keep out of your way. I can sit in my room all day playing games." "I want you to get out. Do something normal. We're not doing each other any good." Marcus was shocked. What did she mean they weren't doing each other any good? She wasn't doing him any good, but what had he done to her? He couldn't think of anything. He felt like crying too.
Chapter 3. The Dead Duck Day. Fiona, how could you do this? Susy screamed. You've got a kid. How could you do this?
Will wanted to go to the Spat picnic in Regent's Park because Susy was going. But he knew that Susy would expect Ned to be there too. So he had to invent a reason why Ned couldn't go. He telephoned Susy on the morning of the picnic and told her that his ex-wife had taken Ned out. "But that's terrible, Will," said Susy. "You can't let her change your plans like that." I know, he said. "And she's taken my car too. Can I go with you to Regent's Park?" "Yes, of course," replied Susy. "I'm bringing a 12-year-old kid too. Marcus, my friend Fiona's son. She's asked me to look after him for the day." All the way to the park, Susy talked about Will's ex-wife. She was very angry about Paula's behaviour. Had he called her Paula? Will couldn't remember. Things were getting rather complicated, he thought. How much longer could he continue pretending? And how could he ever invite Susy round to his flat? There were no toys there, and he didn't even have 2 bedrooms. They walked through the park to the lake. Susy was pushing her daughter, Megan, in a pushchair, and Marcus was walking beside them. Will thought Marcus was a weird kid. He had a very strange haircut and odd clothes. "I don't even know what you do," said Susy. "Nothing." He usually invented a job, but he had told enough lies. He had to give Susy something that was real. "Oh, well, what did you do before?" "Nothing." "You've never worked?" "Well, only for a day or 2. My dad wrote a famous song, and I lived from the royalties." "Michael Jackson makes £60 million an hour," said the weird kid. "How much do you make?" "Marcus," said Susy. "So, what's this song, Will?" Will told them. He hated telling people because the title sounded so silly. "Really?" Susy and Marcus both started singing the same part of the song. People always did this, and he hated that too. "But haven't you ever wanted to work?" asked Susy. "Oh, yes, sometimes, but I never seemed to do anything about it." It was true. Every day for the last 18 years, he had got up in the morning, thinking about finding a job. But by the evening, he had lost interest. He decided to talk to Marcus. If he made friends with Marcus, Susy would think he was a nice guy. "So, Marcus," he said, "who's your favourite footballer?" "I hate football." "Right," said Will. "Well, who's your favourite singer?" "Are you getting these questions out of a book?" asked Marcus. Susy laughed, and Will's face turned red. "No," he said. "OK," said Marcus. "Well, it's Joni Mitchell." "Really?" said Will in surprise. "Does everyone in your school listen to Joni Mitchell?" "Most people." Will was confused. He read a lot of modern music magazines, but none of them had said anything about Joni Mitchell's new popularity. Marcus turned away, so Will began to talk to Susy. "Do you often have to look after him?" he asked. "Not often, but Fiona, his mum, isn't feeling very well." "She's going crazy," said Marcus calmly. "Cries all the time. Doesn't go to work." "She isn't crazy, she just needs a rest." They could see the Spat crowd of mothers and children sitting by the lake in front of them. The mothers were pouring juice into cups, and the children were eating sandwiches. Will played with the children for most of the afternoon. He kept away from the adults sitting on blankets under a tree because he didn't want to have to answer difficult questions about Ned. He kept away from Marcus, too. Marcus was walking round the lake, throwing bits of his sandwich at the ducks. Later, Susy came to talk to him. "You miss him, don't you?" "Who?" He meant it. He had no idea what she was talking about. But then he remembered about Ned. "I'll see him later." "What's he like?" asked Susy. "Oh, nice. He's a really nice boy." Before Susy could ask more questions, Marcus ran over to them. He seemed very nervous and upset. "I think I've killed a duck," he said. Will, Susy, Marcus and Megan stood on the path by the edge of the lake, staring at the duck's dead body in the water. "What happened, Marcus?" Will asked. "I don't know. I was just throwing a piece of my sandwich at it. I didn't mean to kill it." "What's that in the water next to it? Is that the bread you threw at it?" "Yes," said Marcus. He didn't like Will much, so he didn't want to answer his questions. "That's not a sandwich, that's a loaf," said Will. "I'm not surprised the duck was killed." "Perhaps I didn't kill it," said Marcus. "Perhaps it died because it was ill." Nobody said anything. They were all staring so hard at the scene of the crime that they didn't notice the park keeper standing next to them. Marcus felt very frightened. He would be in big trouble now. "One of your ducks has died," said Will. He made it sound like the saddest thing he'd ever seen. Marcus looked up at him. Maybe Will wasn't such a bad guy. "I was told it was your boy's fault," said the park keeper. "It's a crime to kill a duck, you know." "Are you suggesting that Marcus killed this duck? Marcus loves ducks. Don't you, Marcus?" "Yes," said Marcus. "They're my favourite animal. My favourite bird." This was rubbish, because he hated all animals, but he thought it helped. "I was told he was throwing enormous loaves at it." "No," said Will. "He was throwing bread at the duck's body. He wanted to sink it because the sight of a dead bird was upsetting my friend's little girl, Megan." There was a silence. At last the park keeper spoke. "Well, I'll have to go into the water and get it," he said. Marcus felt much better. He wouldn't have to go to prison. They were walking back to the rest of the Spat group when a strange thing happened. Marcus saw, or thought he saw, his mum. She was standing on the path in front of them, and she was smiling. But when he looked again, she wasn't there. Usually, when Susy took Marcus home after a day out, she left him outside his flat and waited until he got inside. But today, she parked the car and lifted Megan out in her car seat. She was never able to explain why she had done this. Will wasn't invited, but he followed them in. Marcus put the key in the door of the flat and opened it, and a new part of his life began, without any warning at all. His mum was half on and half off the sofa. Her face was white, and there was a pool of sick on the carpet, and an empty pill bottle beside her. He couldn't speak. He didn't know what to say. He didn't cry either. The situation was much too serious for that. So he just stood there. But Susy dropped the car seat and ran over to his mum and started screaming at her and shaking her. Marcus was confused. Why was Susy so angry with someone who... Susy shouted at Will to call for an ambulance and told Marcus to make some black coffee. His mum was moving now and making a terrible noise that Marcus had never heard before and never wanted to hear again. "Fiona, how could you do this?" Susy screamed. "You've got a kid! How could you do this?" Suddenly, Marcus understood that his mum had tried to kill herself. He had seen some shocking things, mostly on videos at other people's houses, but they hadn't frightened him because they weren't real life. This situation with his mum was different, because it was very real. There wasn't anything shocking in the room, and he could see that his mum wasn't dead, but it was the most frightening thing he'd ever seen, and he knew he'd never forget it. When the ambulance arrived and Fiona was taken to hospital, the ambulance men didn't want to take Marcus and Megan too. So Susy went to the hospital with Fiona, and Will drove Marcus and Megan there in Susy's car. When they arrived at the hospital, Fiona had already been taken away. "What's happening?" asked Will. He was finding the whole experience very interesting, almost enjoyable. "I don't know. They're pumping her stomach or something. She was talking a little in the ambulance. She was asking about you, Marcus." "That's nice of her." Susy tried to put her arms round him. "Listen, Marcus," she said. "This isn't about you. You know that, don't you? I mean, you're not the reason she's here." "How do you know?" He pushed Susy away and went to get a drink from a machine. "What can you tell a kid whose mother has just tried to kill herself?" Will asked. He really wanted to know. "I don't know," said Susy worriedly, "but we'll have to think of something." They waited in the hospital for a long time. Megan went to sleep, and Marcus ate a lot of sweets and chocolate from the machine. None of them talked much. At last, a woman came over to see them. Not a nurse or a doctor, but somebody official. "Hello. Did you come in with Fiona Brewer?" "Yes, I'm her friend Susy, and this is Will, and this is Fiona's son, Marcus." "Right. We're keeping Fiona here for the night. Is there somewhere Marcus could go?" "He can stay with me tonight," said Susy. She put Megan back into the car seat, and they made their way out to the car park. "I'll see you soon," said Will. "I'll call you." "I hope things are okay with Ned and Paula," Susy said. For a moment, Will didn't know who she meant. Ned and Paula? Ned and Paula. Ah, yes, his ex-wife and son. "Oh, it'll be fine. Thanks." He said goodbye and went to find a taxi. It had been a very interesting experience, but he wouldn't want to repeat it every night.
Chapter 4. Marcus's Plan. It would feel like the beginning of a different, better time. But that time wouldn't last forever. Marcus knew that for him, things would never be the same again.
The next day, Susy took Marcus home and left him while she went to get Fiona from the hospital. He was just tidying the kitchen, as Susy had told him to do, when he saw a note on the kitchen table. He picked it up and sat down. "Dear Marcus, a big part of me knows that I'm doing a wrong, stupid, selfish, unkind thing. But unfortunately, that's not the part that has control of me now. None of this is about you. I've loved being your mum, always, although I've found it difficult sometimes. And I don't know why it isn't enough for me. But it isn't. I just feel very tired, and there doesn't seem to be anything to look forward to. Things will be better for you than they were before. Really. You can go to your dad's, or Susy has always said she'd look after you. Love you, Mum." Marcus was still sitting at the kitchen table when his mum came back from the hospital with Susy and Megan. She could see immediately what he'd found. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I'd forgotten about the note." "You forgot? You forgot you wrote a letter about killing yourself?" "Well, I didn't think I'd ever have to remember it, did I?" She laughed at that. She actually laughed. That was his mother. When she wasn't crying at breakfast, she was laughing about killing herself. "It was stupid of me to leave Marcus here before I went to get you," said Susy. I wasn't thinking." "Susy, none of this is your fault, but maybe Marcus and I ought to have a little talk alone." "Of course," said Susy. She gave Marcus a kiss. "She's fine," she whispered, loud enough for his mum to hear. "Don't worry about her." When Susy had gone, Fiona made tea and sat down at the table with Marcus. "Are you angry with me? What do you think? Because of the letter? Because of the letter? Because of what you did? Everything?" "I can understand that. I don't feel the same as I did on Saturday, if that's any help." "So your problems have all just gone away?" "No, but at the moment..." "At the moment's no good to me," said Marcus. "I can see that you're better at the moment. You've just made tea. But what happens when I go back to school? I can't be here to watch you all the time." "No, I know, but we've got to look after each other." Marcus was no longer interested in what his mum said. The important thing was what she did, or what she was going to do. She wasn't going to try and kill herself again today. She'd drink her tea, and tonight they'd watch TV, and it would feel like the beginning of a different, better time. But that time wouldn't last forever. Marcus knew that, for him, things would never be the same again. 2 people in a family weren't enough. He'd always thought that 2 was a good number, and that he'd hate to live in a family of 3 or 4 or 5. But now he could see that if there were lots of people in a family and one of them died, you wouldn't be left on your own. But how could he make his family grow? He was going to have to find a way. Will kept thinking about Marcus and Fiona. There wasn't much else happening in his life, so he had a lot of time to think about them. He had a strange thought. Perhaps he should try and help them. He telephoned Susy. "I was wondering how Marcus and Fiona are," he said. "Not too bad, I think. She hasn't gone back to work, but Marcus went to school today. Listen, do you think there's any way I could help? Perhaps I could take Marcus out." "Would you like to?" said Susy. "I could ask Fiona." "Thanks," said Will. "And it would be nice to see you and Megan again soon." "Yes," said Susy. "I'm looking forward to meeting Ned." Will bought Time Out, a magazine with information about events in London. He was looking for something that a 12-year-old boy might like to do on a Saturday. He tried to remember what he liked doing at Marcus's age, but he couldn't. Then the telephone rang. "Hi, Will. It's Marcus." "Hi, Marcus." "Susy said you want to take me out for the day on Saturday. I'll come if my mum can come too." "What?" "I'll come if my mum can come too. And she hasn't got any money, so we'll either have to go somewhere cheap or you'll have to pay for us." "Well, wouldn't it be better with just you and me? Your mum could stay at home and have a..." Suddenly Will remembered last Saturday. They had left Fiona at home to rest, and she had tried to kill herself. "I'm sorry, Marcus," he said quickly. "I wasn't thinking. Of course your mum can come too. That would be great." "We haven't got a car. You'll have to bring yours. And you can bring your little boy if you like." He laughed. "Thanks." "That's okay," said Marcus generously. "He'll be with his mum again on Saturday." "Fine. Come round at about 12:30. You remember where we live? Flat 2, 31, Craesfield Road, Islington, London, N1 2SF. "Right," said Will. "See you then." Marcus wasn't really worried about leaving his mum. She was still in a strange, calm mood, but he wanted her to come so that she and Will could meet. And after that, he thought, it should be easy. His mum was pretty, and Will seemed quite rich. They could go and live with him and his kid, and then there would be 4 of them, and 4 was twice as good as 2. Then if one of them died, it wouldn't matter so much. Marcus wasn't even sure whether he liked Will or not, but it didn't matter. He could see that Will wasn't bad or drunk or violent, so he would be okay. And Marcus knew a little about Will. One day on his way home from school, he had seen Will out shopping and had followed him home like a private detective. He hadn't really found out much about him except where he lived, but Will seemed to live alone, no girlfriend, no wife, no little boy. Perhaps the little boy was with his girlfriend at home. But if Will had a girlfriend, why was he trying to get friendly with Susy? When Will arrived on Saturday, his mum was looking good, Marcus thought. She was wearing her best trousers and a hairy jumper, and she was wearing makeup for the first time since the hospital, and a pair of brightly coloured earrings from Zimbabwe. "Thanks for everything you did last weekend," she said. "I'm very grateful." "It was a pleasure. I hope you've... My stomach's fine. I suppose I must still be a bit crazy, though. That sort of thing doesn't get better quickly, does it?" Will looked shocked, but she just laughed. Marcus hated it when she made jokes to people who didn't know her well. Will took them to a restaurant called 28. After they had ordered their food, Marcus hoped that Will and his mum would start talking. But they seemed to be finding it difficult to start a conversation, so he had to help them. "Don't just sit there," he said. "Talk to each other." Both Will and Fiona looked at him. "What do you want us to talk about?" asked Will. "Anything. Politics, films, murders. I don't care." "I'm not sure that's how conversation happens," said his mother. Marcus started asking questions to make them talk, but he wasn't very successful. "Leave us alone, Marcus. You're making it more difficult, not easier," said Fiona. "We'll start talking soon." Then Will asked questions about Marcus's dad, and soon they were talking about relationships. They were talking so much that they didn't notice when the food arrived. Marcus ate his lunch happily. Would they move into Will's place, he wondered, or buy somewhere new? Will knew that Fiona wasn't his type of woman. She didn't look the way he wanted women to look. He didn't think looks were important to her at all. Why didn't she get a good haircut and wear nice clothes? And she was just too strange. He could see now why Marcus was so weird. She believed in things that Will didn't care about, like being a vegetarian. Will still wanted to help them. One evening he was invited to supper at their flat. He didn't like the food very much, something vegetarian with peas and rice and tinned tomatoes, but he quite enjoyed the conversation. Fiona told him about her job as a music teacher, and they talked about his dad's song. But later, Fiona sat down at the piano and started to sing. She wasn't a bad singer, but Will was very embarrassed. She sang old pop songs from the 60s, and she sang them with deep feeling. She even closed her eyes. Then Marcus began to sing too, in the same way, and they made Will sing with them. It was awful. Will could see that he'd made a big mistake about Marcus and Fiona. He couldn't do anything to help people like them. They were too weird, and they felt too deeply about things. Will didn't feel deeply about anything. He couldn't imagine wanting to kill himself. He just wanted to live a long life without... Fiona called Will and left a message on his answer machine, but he didn't call her back. He was trying to return to his old life. He went shopping for CDs and clothes. He played a bit of tennis. He went to the pub and to see films with friends. Then, one afternoon, the doorbell rang. It was Marcus. "I've come to see you," he said. "Oh, right. Come in." Marcus marched into the sitting room, sat down on the sofa, and looked around. "You haven't got a kid, have you?" "Well," began Will. Marcus got up and walked around the flat. "Where's your toilet?" he asked. "It's just down the hall." When Marcus was gone, Will tried to think what he could say about Ned, but he couldn't think of anything. "You've only got one bedroom," said Marcus when he got back. "You've got no children's toys in the bathroom. There are no toys in here. You haven't even got any photos of him." "Is that your business?" "No, but you've been lying to me and my mum and my mum's friend." "Who told you where I live?" "I followed you here once." "Why don't you just go home, Marcus?" "All right, but I'm going to tell my mum." Will couldn't think of any explanation to give Marcus except the truth, that he had invented a child so he could join a single parents group and meet women, and the truth sounded much worse than he had ever intended. "Listen, Will," said Marcus, "I won't say anything to my mum if you go out with her." "Why do you want your mum to go out with someone like me?" "I don't think you're too bad. I mean, you told lies, but you seem okay. She's sad, and I think she'd like a boyfriend." "Marcus, I can't go out with someone just because you want me to. I have to like the person too." "What's wrong with her?" "Nothing's wrong with her, but..." "You want to go out with Susy, don't you?" "I don't want to talk about this with you." "I thought so." "I didn't say anything. I just said..." "Listen, I really don't want to talk about this with you. Go home." "OK," said Marcus, "but I'll be back." When Will had joined Spat, he'd imagined entering the world of single mothers and their sweet children. He hadn't imagined Marcus, and he hadn't expected anyone to break into his world. He was one of life's visitors. He didn't want to be visited.
Chapter 5. New Trainers. "Why do you invite 12-year-old boys round to tea parties in your flat after school?" asked Fiona.
Marcus knew that he couldn't make Will go out with his mum if Will didn't want to. But he knew Will's secret now, so perhaps he could make him do something else. He started going round to Will's flat after school. The first time, Will wasn't very pleased to see him. He stood in the doorway and didn't invite Marcus in. "What?" "I just thought I'd come round. What are you doing?" "Watching Countdown." Marcus knew about Countdown, the most boring programme in the history of television, but he wanted to get inside Will's flat. "I could watch it with you if you want. I really like it." Will looked at him for a time. "All right, come in." There were lots of interesting things in Will's flat. Hundreds of CDs, records and cassettes. There were pictures from films on the wall and black and white photos of people with musical instruments. "Who are these people? And why are they on your wall?" "They're musicians, and they're on my wall because I like their music and they're cool." "Why are they cool?" "I don't know. Because they took drugs and died, probably. Marcus thought he wouldn't want pictures on his wall of people who took drugs and died. He'd want to forget all about that kind of thing, not look at it every day of his life. Will made tea in the kitchen. Then they went back into the living room and sat down on the sofa. "Do you like school?" Will asked. "No, I hate it." "Why? Do the other kids bully you?" Marcus looked at him. How did he know that? "Not really. Just a couple of kids." "What do they do to you?" "Nothing really. Just, say things about my hair and glasses and my singing. Sometimes I sing without noticing." Will laughed. "It's not funny." "I'm sorry, but you could do something about your hair. You could have it cut in the way you want it. This is how I want it." "Why do you want your hair like that?" "Because that's how it grows, and I hate going to the hairdresser." "I can see that. How often do you go?" "Never. My mum cuts it." "Your mum? How old are you? 12? You're old enough to get your hair cut yourself. You could get married in 4 years' time. Will you let your mum cut your hair then?" Marcus didn't think he'd be married in 4 years' time, but he understood what Will was telling him and knew that Will was right. But there was another way of looking at the situation. If his mum was going to cut his hair in 4 years' time, then she would still be alive. Marcus visited Will a lot that autumn, and by about the 3rd or 4th visit he felt that Will was getting used to him. They didn't talk about much at first, but one day Will said, "How's the situation at home?" for no reason that Marcus could understand. "You mean my mum?" "Yes." "She's all right, thanks." Marcus had never talked about it, and he'd never said how he felt. But what he felt, all the time, every day, was a horrible fear. This was the main reason why he came round to Will's after school. Every time he climbed the stairs at home, he remembered the dead duck day. When he saw his mum watching the news, or eating or preparing work on the dining table, he wanted to cry, or be sick or something. But he couldn't talk about it. "Are you still worried about her?" "A bit, when I think about it." "How often do you think about it?" "I don't know." He thought about it all the time. All the time. All the time. Could he say that to Will? He didn't know. He couldn't say it to his mum, or to his dad, or to Susy. They would all be too worried about him. He just wanted a promise from someone, anyone, that it wouldn't happen again, ever. And no one could do that. Will was wishing that he hadn't asked Marcus about Fiona, because it was clear that the boy was very upset. Will wasn't used to coping with people with real-life problems. He liked watching people's problems on TV, but he'd never had anyone with problems on his sofa before. Sometimes they managed conversations about other things, like Marcus's dad. "Do you see your dad often?" "Quite often. Some weekends. He's got a girlfriend called Lindsay. She's nice." "Would you like to see him more than you do?" "No." "Well, that's all right then." The next week, while Will was watching Countdown as usual, he was interrupted by a long, urgent ring on the doorbell. He got up off the sofa and opened the door. Marcus was standing on the doorstep, and 2 ugly-looking boys were throwing hard sweets at him. Some sweets hit Will. "What do you think you're doing?" He couldn't remember the last time he had been so angry. The boys ran away, and Will went back into the flat. Marcus was sitting on the sofa watching Countdown. Who were they? "I don't know their names," said Marcus, his eyes on the TV. "They're in the class 2 years above me at school." "Marcus, does this happen often?" "Well, they've never thrown sweets at me before." "I'm not talking about the sweets. I'm talking about older kids bullying you." Oh, yes, not those two. No, OK, not those two. Yes, lots. Right. That's what I've been trying to find out. Your problem is, Marcus, that you look different from other kids. That's why they notice you. You need to look more like them. You need the same clothes and haircut and glasses as everyone else. You can be as weird as you want on the inside. Just do something about the outside. Will took Marcus shopping in Holloway Road and bought him a pair of expensive Adidas trainers. Marcus thought they were cool, and Will was pleased. He couldn't remember feeling as good as this before. He had made an unhappy boy happy, and there hadn't been any advantage in it for him at all. He didn't even want to sleep with the boy's mother. But the next day, Marcus's new trainers were stolen. He came home from school wearing only a pair of black socks. "Where are your shoes?" Fiona screamed. She hadn't noticed that he had been wearing new trainers. "Stolen." "Stolen? Why would anyone want to steal your shoes?" "Because—" He was going to have to tell her the truth, although he knew the truth would lead to a lot of questions. "Because they were nice ones. They were new Adidas trainers. Will bought them for me." "Will who?" "Will, the guy who took us to lunch." "Yes, the guy from Spat. He's become my friend." "He's become your friend?" Marcus was right. His mum had lots of questions, but she asked them in a very boring way. She just repeated the last thing he said, made it into a question, and shouted. "I go round to his flat after school." "You go round to his flat after school?" "Well, you see, he doesn't really have a kid." "He doesn't really have a kid?" When the questions had finished, he was in a lot of trouble, although probably not as much trouble as Will. Marcus put his old shoes back on, and then he and his mother went straight to Will's flat. Will opened the door, and Fiona immediately started shouting at him about Spat and his imaginary son. At first, Will looked embarrassed. He had no answers to her questions, so he stood there, staring at the floor. But as it continued, he started to get angry too. "Why do you invite 12-year-old boys round to tea parties in your flat after school?" asked Fiona. Will looked at her. "Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" He went red in the face and started shouting very loudly. "Your son invites himself round here. Sometimes he's followed by other kids who attack him. I could leave him outside, but I let him in for his own safety. I won't do it again. Now, if you've finished, you can both—" "I haven't finished yet, actually. Why did you buy him a pair of expensive trainers?" Because look at him." "What's wrong with him?" Will looked at her. "You really don't know, do you? Marcus is being eaten alive at school by the other kids. He gets bullied every day." "Marcus is doing fine," his mother said. Marcus couldn't believe she'd said that. He wasn't doing fine. His mum was being blind and stupid and crazy. "You're joking," said Will. "I know he's taking some time to get used to his new school, but—" Will laughed. "Oh, yes, and after a couple of weeks he'll be okay. When they've stopped stealing his shoes and following him home from school, everything will be great." That was wrong. They were all mad. "I don't think so," said Marcus. "It's going to take more than a couple of weeks." "It's okay. I know," said Will. "I was joking." Marcus didn't think there was much to joke about in the situation, but he was very pleased that Will understood what was happening to him at school. He'd only known Will for a short time, and he'd known his mother all his life, so why could Will understand and his mother couldn't? But now his mother understood too, because Will had told her. "You're not going to Will's again," Fiona said to Marcus on the bus on the way home. "If you've got anything to say, you say it to me. If you need new clothes, I'll get them." "But you don't know what I need." "I don't know what I need. Only Will knows. He knows what kids wear." We don't need that kind of person. We're doing all right our way. Marcus, I've been your mother for 12 years. I do know what I'm doing. Marcus didn't think either of them was doing all right. He wondered if his mother had a kind of plan for him. In the next few days, he began to notice the way she talked to him. He was interested in everything she said about what he should watch on TV, or listen to, or read, or eat. She had always said it was important to talk about things, and that she wanted him to think for himself. They had often discussed what was bad about fashion and modern pop music and computer games. But if she didn't like what he said, she argued with him until he agreed with her. But he hadn't agreed, really. He'd just lost the argument. "I've been thinking for myself," he said, "and I want to go round to Will's flat after school." "No, he's a rich guy who doesn't work, who tells lies, and he understands about school. He bought me those trainers. He knows things." He was getting annoyed. "I'm thinking for myself, and it doesn't work. You always win." "Marcus, it's not enough to tell me you're thinking for yourself. You've got to show me, too. Give me a good reason why you want to go round to Will's." Marcus gave her a reason. It wasn't the right reason, and he felt bad saying it because it made her cry. But it was a good reason, and he won the argument. "Because I need a father."
End of CD 1.